I never loved my stepbrother. Truthfully, I couldn't even say that I liked him. But by no means did he deserve his fate, whatever it may have been. I'm putting my memories to paper now, as best as I can recall them, before the pills and the therapy snatched them away forever. We became a family when I was only 6 years of age. My mother had died when I was barely out of infancy, and my father, in his loneliness and grief, turned towards the first woman who showed him an inkling of interest, or at least tolerance. After a long and tumultuous marriage, they tied their vows and almost immediately began to make each other miserable, a theme which resonated between me and my new stepbrother. Daniel wasn't a literal monster, but in the eyes of a younger sibling, he might as well have been. 2 years to my senior, I grew up dreading the inevitability of the daily teasing and beating, knowing he would make my life day in and day out miserable. There is one instance that sticks out in particular now, perhaps resurfaced by the irony of recent events which led up to my incarceration. We grew up in a small country town, and our backyard consisted of a massive forest which stretched as far as a child could wander. I spent many hours in the woods, and where most children might feel lost or scared in the wilds, I felt safe from the conflicts that ravaged my home, away from Daniel and that evil woman he called a mother. Not too far into the woods, just up a hill and through a thick bramble, there was a pond of decent size, one that was old, stagnant, and covered with a film of algae. While most of the forest was a comfort, the pond always bothered me. I hated that thing. I hated everything about it, from its sickly green appearance to the faithfully putrid stench that the still water produced. But it was wide enough and covered a large stretch of the forest it was necessary to pass during my hikes. One day, while I was completely unaware, my stepbrother decided to follow me. He stalked me through the forest as I explored, just out of sight, like a predator on the hunt. As I paused by the pond to gather up some stones, Daniel silently closed the gap between us, creeping between the trees as he approached. I never saw him coming. Next thing I knew, I was pushed through the air and tumbled down into the water, crashing through the layer of algae into the coldness of the pond. I panicked, struggling for air, desperate to escape the murky water that I was sure would swallow me up and leave nothing of me to be found. As I fought to breach the surface, I found that I was being held down, forced to hold my last bit of air that burned to escape my lungs. Every terrible fear I knew felt like a reality, waiting for me at the bottom of the pond. Finally, when I was all but sure I was about to die, I found myself released. I broke to the surface with a gasp, every muscle in my body screaming for air and the comfort of the shore. When I reached safety and I had come to my senses, I became aware of an uproarious laughter behind me. I turned and saw what I should have expected, my stepbrother cackling like a madman at his brilliant ambush. Of course, when we arrived home, his mother would hear nothing of my side of the story. Daniel told her I fell in, and his best clothes were ruined trying to save me from drowning. The thrashing she gave me for my quote unquote lies was one of the worst I have ever received, and I was forbidden to ever venture into the forest again. As I said, I never loved my stepbrother, but there was one time, and perhaps the only one time, that I felt close to him, and it took the death of his mother. It happened when we were 17 and 19, respectively. While she was walking home from a liquor store late at night, a drunk driver swerved over just a few inches off the road and struck her in the side. As she fell, her head landed on the guardrail, killing her instantly. Our family is just full of little ironies. In his grief, Daniel turned to God. I myself was a devout agnostic, finding no fault in faith, but many in religion. At the time, I supported his newfound devotion, believing it would be a positive influence in his life. After all, I couldn't think of any religion that would condone his prior behavior. At the very least, perhaps I would earn some well-deserved apologies for the childhood of mistreatment. He founded a church near home, one that I have never heard of, the Church of the Shepherd and the Spider.J Saints, and spent most of his spare time engaging in study. As he had recently moved away into a nearby apartment complex, I rarely saw him anymore, and I was happy to no longer suffer his presence. I focused on my schoolwork and looking after my father, who had once again fallen into depression and drank after losing his second wife. My stepbrother came by every few weeks to see how we were doing, and I quickly noticed a great improvement in his character. As I had hoped, he expressed deep remorse for his childish behavior and often sought to make amends. On occasion, he would bring us small gifts or take us out to dinner, little tokens of gratitude for putting up with him for so long. However, Daniel treated any information about his church like a closely guarded secret. Whenever I pressed for details, he would casually deflect my questions, often changing the topic as quickly and politely as possible. I learned almost nothing about his congregation and could barely ascertain the specific branch of faith that he followed. In passing, he would sometimes make reference to stars or shepherds, which I assumed must have been a reference to the story of the Nativity. Another time, I overheard him on the phone talking to who I assumed was his pastor, referring to King of Kings, another metaphor I attributed to Christianity. Still, my brother was a private man, and I assumed at first his reluctance to talk about his faith stemmed from the desire to not impose it upon us, a position that I, at the time, was happy for. Then, almost 6 months to the day of his mother's death, he told us he planned to be rebaptized. Of course, my father and I approved. He wanted us to be present at the ceremony, which would be held the following Sunday at a lake not far from home. I found myself feeling anxious as the date approached, as I was not accustomed to the ritual of a man being dunked underwater to absolve him of his sins. It seemed quite ridiculous, a notion that I could not really comprehend. But I wanted to appear supportive. After all, anything that would help my stepbrother become a better man had to be something worthwhile. The day came, and my father and I arrived dressed in our best clothes, which, given our finances, weren't much to speak of. My father was so proud, he managed to stay sober for the whole ceremony, which is a small miracle unto itself. There were few parishioners present than I thought would be there, only a dozen in all, not including the pastor and my stepbrother. The pastor was an older man, I estimate somewhere in his late 40s, from his balding head. He was sporting a robe that was all black, save for the small crimson emblem emblazoned near the right breast pocket, that is. From a distance appeared to be a cross, weathered in flames. He was pale, almost sickly, and wore spectacles that looked like they were designed from some earlier century. Yet, what stands out of my mind now, above all else, was his smile. A grin that stretched ear to ear, like you'd imagine a shark would wear before feeding. Daniel approached us from the crowd, looking as pleased as I have ever seen him. He moved up for a hug, which I modestly returned.
I'm so happy you both can make it.
He exclaimed, making no attempt to hide his joy.
This is a big day for me, a huge day. Today everything turns around, I swear it.
He paused, and then,
Brother.
the words took me back a bit, and for a moment I was left speechless. In all the years I had known him, we have never been willing to consider each other true siblings, and this was the first time I had heard him call me as such. I'm happy to be here too, Dan. I stumbled over my words, still not ready to extend the same courtesy. Though in time, I thought, maybe one day, soon, I could.
I'm so sorry to interrupt,
The pastor exclaimed by the lake's edge.
but we do have appointments to keep, Daniel.
Excuse me, "Father," my dad said, a little shocked, as was I, the pastor's rudeness. "We just got here, and we'd like to have a few words with—"
No, Dad, it's alright.
Daniel said, cutting him off mid-sentence.
There are rules we have to follow. It's okay. We'll be done in just a minute.
He turned from us and returned to the group. Noticing them for the first time, I saw that none of them were wearing clothes that one would consider appropriate for such a special occasion. In fact, all of them were wearing the same outfit, a bland black and white wool garment that would have looked more at home in an Amish community. I began to wonder if my brother had joined some kind of cult. However, I followed them anyway, down to the lake's edge.
As my stepbrother began to wade into the lake, hand in hand with his pastor, he paused, looked back towards my father and I, with a look that I can only describe as concern, or perhaps even remorse. And he said 3 words that will haunt me to my grave.
Don't be afraid.
And before I could ask him what he meant, he turned back and walked into the water. As he moved deeper, the crowd around us, without cue, began singing a strange hymn that I had never heard before. Ominous, but uplifting at the same time. The inflection in their tone was closer to a chant than a melody. It was around that time that I realized they were singing in perfect Latin, and that something was terribly wrong. I dare not even attempt to transcribe it here. Disregarding my brother's warning, I felt an intense desire to flee, to run into the water and rescue Daniel from what I was sure was a horrible mistake, to escape into the woods and leave this surreal scene as many miles behind us as possible. But even this instinct grew. My feet felt rooted to the spot, my eyes transfixed on the ritual, and I'm unable to look away. While the pastor was now in the lake past his waist, Daniel was slightly taller, so he crouched down in the water to stand with his head just below the man's shoulders. He looked up at the pastor, his face awash in awe. As the man raised his hand above my stepbrother's head, he began to speak. "We are here today to cleanse our brother Daniel of his sins, to wash his spirit clean in this holy lake, and present him to our Lord as a man of faith renewed, his soul reborn, his devotion absolute." He closed his eyes, and with a look of utmost concentration, uttered a chant in another tongue, one that I still haven't been able to place a region or time in known history. Even without knowing their meaning, I could sense a power in those words, one that no other religion could claim authority over. It lasted all of 30 seconds, but when he finished speaking, I felt as if I'd been trapped in them for days. And then, with a swiftness I wouldn't have expected from a man of his advanced age, he lowered his hand onto the scruff of my stepbrother's neck, and with the other arm submerged my brother into the lake. In preparation for this day, I'd watched other baptisms on the internet, so I would know what to expect. I knew my brother shouldn't have been under the surface for more than half a second. A hole if the pastor wasn't quite quick as the younger ministers. But then, at 6 seconds, Daniel was still being held under, and my father began yelling. I honestly couldn't tell you what he screamed at the pastor. The next minute of my memory is still terribly muddled by what transpired. When I try to remember, there are small gaps, small details that I've forgotten, as if I am still trying to come to terms with the impossible. What I do remember is terrible enough, and I hope these abstractions are merely my psyche trying to cope with the reality. This is what I recall. As my father stormed off into the lake, the choir of strangers around us ceased their singing, and aside from the sound of my father's ranting and splashing, it became unnaturally quiet, and the air became as still as a crypt. I remember then my father ceasing his advance, stopping mid-sentence as he became aware, as I was, that there was something utterly dark and unholy transpiring before us. It was then that the pastor looked up from where he had held my brother, who had been under the water a full 20 seconds, and slowly shifted his gaze onto me. He smiled, still, but that vaguely off-putting grin had transformed, twisted itself into an expression of simple, unmistakable malice. His eyes were pitch black, Daniel, who by now was surely drowning, began to thrash in the water, his death throbs kicking up waves that disrupted the perfect silence that had descended on the lake. My brother was a strong man, young and healthy, and yet this old priest held him under the surface like he was a child, his grip unrelenting. He was dying before me, and yet, to my horror, I was still stuck in place, unable to move. The struggle did not end, however, it was interrupted. Originating from the spot where my brother had been fighting for his life, I noticed a dark stain spreading slowly across the surface. A jet black substance that seemed to have the consistency of ink or oil, branching into tendril-like form that seemingly moved with purpose, defiling the water as it crept closer to the shore. Here is an empty spot in my memory, a moment I'm sure I don't wish to remember. Where it resumes, my father is gone. The next moment I recall, I'm standing alone on the shore. The parish had disappeared, presumably taken by whatever my father was taken by, or perhaps dispersed into the forest, finding the ritual satisfactory. In the water, though, the pastor still stands, holding my brother down, whose last desperate struggles were dying down, and were futile thrashes, barely causing a ripple over the surface. Then, the last few bubbles of escaping air, I knew he was gone. The pastor was still staring at me. His eyes were the same shade as the stain that consumed the lake, his gaze never leaving mine, his smile never faltering. He wore a look of grim satisfaction, knowing that the godless act had come to a completion, and, his eyes never leaving mine, he began to slowly descend into the depths, as if the ground beneath had opened up beneath him and swallowed him, accepting him into the dark. It was only then, alone by the lakeside, that I found I could move again. I promptly fell to my knees and wept.
Dad! Daniel! No! No!
The police never found my brother, my father, or any proof that the church existed. They even had the audacity to accuse me of their murder, but I was released on lack of evidence. After all, there wouldn't be much of a case if they couldn't find any bodies to pin me to. Begrudgingly, they sent me to the care of the local psychiatric hospital. While the staff there has treated me well, I hold a bitter resentment towards them. No one ever believes my story. They call it the fevered delusions of a disconnected mind. They try to drown my memory in pills and hunt for hidden meanings, but they'll never find one. I am certain, as terrible and impossible as it may be, that what I saw, what I witnessed, is beyond the grasp of a sane mind. I know it to be true, and when I lie in my bed at night, unable to sleep, I comfort myself into thinking my brother knew what he was volunteering for. I tell myself his faith had revealed to him that there exist gods older than man, than religion, perhaps older than time itself, gods that lie just beyond our understanding, waiting for their chance to reign again. He knew that they were coming, and chose to willingly give himself up to them, to usher their return to our world. And I hear, as if he were standing right beside me, his final